Alex Gupta with UATV. Today I'll be speaking with Matthew Schaaf about the abuse of human rights in Crimea. Mr. Schaaf is the project director for Ukraine at Freedom House. Welcome to the studio, Mr. Schaaf.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
What does Freedom House do, and what does it do in Ukraine?
Freedom House has two main areas of activity. One is reporting and analysis about the human rights, civil and political liberty situation across the world. And so we release 4 reports every year, which focus on different aspects of civil and political liberties. And all 4 of those reports have chapters about developments in Ukraine over the year. And we actually just recently released our Freedom in the World report, which is the main report that we produce that reports on civil and political liberties in every country and also several territories, including Crimea. Our office and our work in Ukraine is more project-based, so we certainly contribute to the analysis that is included in our reports. But we also work very closely with Ukrainian civil society organizations, with media, with the government to improve respect for human rights, strengthen Ukrainian democracy, and so on.
There was one report or element of report that was released yesterday on your website that I wanted to go over today.
Sure.
And it was the 5 ways human rights have dwindled in Crimea. So the first element that you have in your report is staged and managed elections. Mm-hmm. What did you mean by that?
So this sort of blog was a summation of the Freedom in the World report about Crimea, which the text of which was just released yesterday as well. And so we were trying to make the key conclusions accessible to a wider population. In terms of elections, what we mean is there were elections held by Russian occupation authorities in Crimea last year for seats in the parliament, the Russian parliament, that is, and they were not fair and free elections where people could make their own choice about which candidates and which parties to vote for, and where candidates and parties could freely choose to participate or not. What we see in these elections and in previous elections in Crimea is that only parties that support the Russian government, and certainly not parties that criticize the occupation of Crimea and human rights abuses there, are not allowed to participate in these elections. So not only is there not sort of free access to elections in Crimea, but voters aren't able to make their own choice, even with the parties that do exist and the candidates that are running. So, for example, there were lots of reports of the government pressuring people to vote in certain ways, of bosses at companies or government organizations pressuring employees to vote in certain ways. So the election isn't an election in the sense of what we would expect in a democracy. It was a process that was organized by the Russian government to make it look like democracy was alive in Crimea and that people were sharing their democratic opinions.
So we see threats and pressuring from bosses. Was there any, threats from the FSB or police organizations?
On the elections specifically, I'm not sure off the top of my head, but certainly the FSB is contributing to a climate of fear in Crimea. And we document this in our Freedom in the World report on Crimea, and many other organizations, Ukrainian human rights organizations and others have documented this. They have targeted the Crimean Tatar minority. They have targeted individuals and organizations that are connected with Ukraine, that use Ukrainian language, Ukrainian religious institutions, and human rights activists, and so on. So the FSB has definitely been a tool to strengthen Russian occupation over Crimea. and I would also expect that during the elections they were playing a similar role.
Because one of the other points is there's a climate of fear, that you have the FSB there, and there's this idea, there's this sentiment in the air that there is no freedom. That there's a lot of pressure, that people are scared.
Yeah, the FSB certainly is playing a role in that. There are others as well. There are so-called self-defense forces, the local police and others who are essentially the enforcers of the political regime in Crimea right now. They're enforcing not only the sort of the wishes of the Kremlin, but also the Russian legal system, which is now being implemented in Crimea, that makes it very hard for people to express opinions or ideas that differ from the official Kremlin line. So, for example, people who talk about the annexation of Crimea and human rights abuses there, people who don't agree with Russia's efforts to annex Crimea could be accused of separatism under Russian law. And so the FSB is using these types of laws and these types of threats to essentially control what people are able to say. This relates not only to people, to individuals, but also to the media. When Crimea was controlled by Ukrainian authorities, so prior to the attempted annexation, there were thousands of media outlets, and the Russian government required that media re-register under Russian law, which was being enforced in Crimea at the time, and that only somewhere in the range of 300 media outlets were able to re-register. And all of the media outlets that were, for example, publishing in Ukrainian language, that were Ukrainian, are no longer operating in Crimea, unfortunately.
So that kind of goes with another point. There's seeing a forced Russification in Crimea.
Yeah, so media is certainly one way where not only people that are broadcasting in Ukrainian, but also people, media that expresses sort of pro-Ukrainian points of view or opposition to the annexation are not able to operate. But it's not only with media. Ukrainian Catholic and Orthodox churches have also been persecuted. Their property has been confiscated by the authorities in Crimea. Ukrainian language schools aren't operating anymore, so it's quite difficult for people who want to continue to use Ukrainian, to study Ukrainian, for their children to study Ukrainian, to do that. As we all know, everyone was forced to get Russian passports. Now, there are people that have chosen not to get Russian passports, but the occupation authorities, the Russian government, have made it very difficult for those people to live in Crimea. For example, they can't get public health care without having a Russian passport. And so we're seeing that in these efforts to sort of integrate Crimea into the Russian system that is being Russified, not only in a language sense, but in many other senses. And then I think the last really important dynamic is actually like a large increase in the number of Russians in Crimea. Certainly there are people who are in the Russian military who have been transferred to Crimea, but also people working for the government and others. So there are, based on reports, tens of thousands of more Russians who were moved to Crimea in order to participate in this annexation.
I know your organization reports a lot on the crackdown on Crimean Tatars. Would you be able to explain more of what's happened with regard to that in the last few months?
Sure. Crimean Tatar community is of course quite diverse, and At the same time, when the Green Men started appearing in Crimea and all of the other processes to try to annex it by Russia, Crimean Tatar community was quite vocal in their opposition to Russian rule, to annexation by Russia, and since then, it's also been especially targeted by the occupation authorities. Not only Crimean Tatar community, certainly anyone who opposes the annexation is targeted, but Crimean Tatars in particular. And so it's been manifested in lots of different ways. For example, persecution of activists, persecution of lawyers who are defending Crimean Tatar people in the courts. Certainly, there's also a language component, and it's similar to Ukrainian, much more difficult to learn Crimean Tatar, to keep the language in use alive in Crimea these days. There is also a crackdown on religious believers among the Crimean Tatar community. One of the things we're seeing is allegations of Crimean Tatar people participating in Hizb ut-Tahrir, and allegations of religious extremism and so on, as a way to essentially lock people up in jail. And there are a lot of people in jail now for these reasons. Last year, the annexation authorities also moved to outlaw the Mejlis, which is an organization that represents the Crimean Tatar people, and it was ruled extremist by a prosecutor in Crimea, and this decision was confirmed by the Russian Supreme Court in September of last year, which essentially means that anyone who is connected to the Mejlis, whether officially or unofficially, is then considered to be connected to an extremist organization and could then be punished as a result of that. So we're seeing not only sort of specific efforts to stamp out Crimean Tatar participation in life and their ability to, be free citizens in their own land, but also sort of the political pressure on the community, on the identity of this group.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Matthew Schaaf. Really appreciate it.
Happy to.
I'm Alex Gupta with UATV, speaking with Matthew Schaaf, Project Director for Ukraine at Freedom House. Thank you so much.